Okay, this is Paul. I did a framing video of the evening with Matt Dillahunty and Jordan Peterson, and I'm going to Twitch it. Now, when I say Twitch it, it's if anybody knows what twitching or what the Twitch channel is, where video gamers play games and, add commentary, watch themselves play games and other people watch. That's essentially what I do with a lot of these things. And so let's if you want the introduction to what I'm just about to do, watch that video, and now I'm going to just do some commentary as we go. So let's go.
They're going nuts.
Right away, notice what's happening here. There's a frame. They shook hands. They're wearing clothing. They're on a stage. The selection of the chairs, the drinks, the smiles, this is all embedded. Now, we don't see these things because we just assume them. But when someone breaks from them, again, I'm not making this, this is all Peterson stuff. If someone breaks the conventions even slightly, if Peterson were to walk on stage and not shake Dillahunty's hand, everyone would notice and everyone would talk about it. And the entire conversation would have been different. But he shakes his hand, and all of the smiling, the body language, the signal, this is all, we're going to have a pleasant conversation. There aren't any guns or knives. No one's going to get hurt. We're going to talk ideas. This is the game that we're playing.
They were so loud, I was almost knocked over into my chair. How are you?
Ready to go?
All right.
See, and even greeting, how are you? What is that? What it is socialization. This is how we're greeted. This is how we start. Pay attention to the body language. I'm not, what's that, Bombard, the woman that does those things, but yeah, look at the body language. We can all read that body language. It's, they're looking at each other, they're smiling, they're saying, I'm ready to talk, but I'm also ready to debate.
Well, there were people who came and were like, oh, this was said, and this was said, and this was said, and we talked a little bit about dinner. I thought it would be nice if we
And they had dinner together. Well, that's important too.
Started with something quick and easy and simple, like God. In particular, I don't believe there is one, and I have no idea what your thoughts are on it.
And again, see my framing video, because Peterson has been saying, it depends on what you mean by believe, and it depends on what you mean by God. Now, Dillahunty says, I don't believe there is one. Well, in a sense now, he's just made God an object. And again, I talked about that in the framing video, so watch that one first.
You mean on the fact that you don't believe there is one?
Ah.
And now Peterson right away is, even in this move, he's saying, what you're placing in front of us is not what's just in front of us. There's way more going on here than just this one little question. And there's a whole frame around us that draws us to that point. I want us to see more of the frame.
I mean, just about the subject in general, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts on about what I don't think is, well, maybe.
Well, it's a complicated problem, and I don't think that we take it with due seriousness.
Notice Peterson called it a problem. Well, what's the problem? Dillahunty didn't mention a problem. Again, Peterson's trying to pull us back into a bigger frame.
I specifically don't think that the celebrity atheist types, who I actually have a fair bit of respect for, by the way, take it with due seriousness. So I don't think that they take it with due seriousness from a biological perspective or a phenomenological perspective or a literary perspective or a metaphoric perspective. That'll do for starters.
And again, look at that list. Again, if you've listened to Peterson, that list should not surprise any of us.
I've become convinced that the fundamental presuppositions of our very functional cultures, or Western cultures say, are nested immovably in a metaphorical substrate. And that when you enter that metaphorical substrate, you're in the domain of religious phenomenology.
In a sense, you could stop listening right now, because that's the whole point.
And I think that not only can you derive that conclusion as a consequence of deep philosophical thought and literary analysis, but that if you know enough about brain function, you'll also come to the same conclusion. I think you come to the same conclusion as well if you look at the evolution of religious cognition from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist and not from the position of a evolutionary biologist whose head is addled by the belief that most of human morality was established in the 500 years since the Enlightenment.
Okay, so we're going to talk ethics, an evolutionary biologist. Well, he's talking about the celebrity atheists whose head is addled. What does that mean? Well, he's switched a word. Drug addled is usually what we expect with that word. His head is addled. Well, what's he saying? Well, that this assumption that it's only since the Enlightenment that we've learned how to act is a crazy idea. Now, think about that, because it isn't the case that suddenly in the Enlightenment everything changed right away. You read Charles Taylor, 500 years of history since the Enlightenment to get to the point where the belief in God is no longer axiomatic. Those are Charles Taylor's words. So Peterson is saying, there's a lie going on right now, and I think it's a lie because people aren't thinking clearly, and they're not thinking clearly from a philosophical point of view, from a phenomenological point of view, from a moral point of view. They're not thinking clearly at all. Now, well, here we go.
So that's a start, I guess.
Except, and so you have to bear with me.
Yeah.
Because I'm from Texas.
That's okay. I'm from Alberta, It's bigger than Texas, just as bad.
A lot colder.
Yeah. So the curious thing for me is all of that applies, seemingly, if I'm understanding it, to religious thought, religious tradition, the value of religious identity to individuals. And I don't see that any of it relates to whether or not there is a God or whether or not there's sufficient reason to believe there's a God.
Okay. Right here, right away, we see the frames. Peterson just put out his phenomenological, pragmatic, psychological frame, and Dillahunty just put out his materialist, ontological frame. And again, go back and look at my framing video. I lay them both out. Right away at the beginning, we have the two frames. But now also pay attention. Both men are groomed, dressed. I think, I didn't check Peterson's hand. Both are probably wearing wedding rings. They're both married. They might both be wearing watches. They're both wearing suits. They're both wearing shoes. They're sitting in identical chairs. They're drinking the same. I mean, this is all Peterson's point, that there's way, way more that's going on here in terms of how we behave than just this idea of whether or not we're believing in a God or not.
Which is my sticking point. I'm fully fine with the idea.
That's a sticking point. He says, this is my question. I've got my modernist ontology. This is my frame. I'm not going to be moved from it.
Yeah. We'll try and get through this without raucous applause, but hey, at least I got one.
Yeah, you don't never complain about raucous applause.
And the humor going back and forth. Again, this is all ethics, that they're both signaling to each other, I'm your friend, we're not going to hurt each other, we're going to have a conversation. The crowd applauded, and Dillahunty kind of topping them down, saying we're not going to get into this feeding frenzy of who can please the audience, and even though maybe the audience is very much on my side because it's my fan base, this is all deference giving. There's so many signals happening here.
Because that's a sticking point for me. I have no problem acknowledging that people derive value from their beliefs, whether or not they map to anything in reality, that they can be inspired and motivated, educated, and enlightened by poetry, prose, metaphor, allegory. But
okay, Inspired, motivated, enlightened. Where do we find that? Well, inside our heads. And now that might move out into some action, but he's a materialist. So inspiration, motivation, enlightenment, these are all mental acts, and they are experiences that we have, but they don't have any bearing. Charles Taylor, now the buffered self, they don't have any bearing on ontology, especially something like supernatural ontology. These are human experiences. Okay, now we get into C.S. Lewis. This is the whole show. All of these experiences have come up from history all the way to here, just like this book. This book just jump into existence. You can start with this book and go in an X minus one series of moments to have the discovery of paper and ideas, and everything in this book is a product of the whole show. And it all started with the singularity, and we can go all the way back to the singularity from this book. This is, again, he's in his frame.
My concern is, having grown up a fundamentalist Southern Baptist, the people who I know and some of the people who are working to enact legislation on behalf of their beliefs are convinced that they have good reason to believe that there actually is a God, not just that it's useful to them.
Okay, so these people believe things, not just that it's useful for them. Okay, and obviously Dillahunty and the people that he's now talking about also believe that whether or not there is a God impacts what's going on in their worlds. That belief impacts their worlds. But Dillahunty wants to talk not about just the belief impacting their worlds, but the ontology. And Peterson is going to be skeptical about this. Whoops, wrong button.
Well, it's not that easy to distinguish between what's useful and what's real. So
right there. Again, go back to my framing. What's useful and what's real. I mentioned, let's say a woman is sure that her husband is having an affair. She feels betrayed. She sees evidence of the affair, and so she commits suicide. Well, let's say there's an investigation. No such woman can be found that the husband has been sleeping with. He swears he's not had an affair. All of the evidence that the woman found could be attributable to other things. The conversations on the man's cell phone were just work-related. They were innocent. She read them the wrong way. Was this mistress real? Real enough to commit suicide? That's not the same definition of real that Dillahunty is using.
I think that distinction can be made, but it's a lot more difficult than people generally think. And I also think that there's no doubt that there are different levels of sophistication of religious belief. You know, what I see happening in this sort of discussion, say frequently, and again, like I said, I have a fair bit of respect for the atheist types because they spend a lot of time thinking, and that's generally a good thing. I see most of their thinking, however, directed at the fundamentalist types, the fundamentalist Christian types, mostly of the American persuasion, who suffer from the somewhat understandable illusion that the biblical corpus has the same epistemological and ontological status as a scientific theory, when it clearly doesn't, right? I mean, if you're...
Okay, now we're closer to the same page.
Okay,
yeah.
If you're a religious thing...
Okay, so now they can agree on the fundamentalists, but now here, the fundamentalists and Dillahunty are really in many ways on the same page. They are within the same frame, and so the fight that Dillahunty and Richard Dawkins, again, go back and listen to Justin Brierley's, go find Unbelievable, the Justin Brierley podcast with Richard Dawkins and an evangelical and a Jewish scholar. Richard Dawkins says, I don't have a problem with you two. You two are reasonable people. It's all those people who are trying to get evolution out of textbooks in Kansas and Oklahoma and trying to limit abortion and so on and so forth. It's their actions I have problems with. And as I, again, mentioned in the framing video, what's interesting about the modernists here is that they don't necessarily have a problem with someone believing what they want to believe. They have a problem with people taking their beliefs and bringing them out and having those acting on their beliefs. And so right away, we're going to be getting into pragmatism.
Thinker, let's say, if you're a serious student of religious thought and a serious philosopher, one of the things you can't claim is that whatever story the Bible is telling is a scientific theory. And that's just self-evident. First of all, like, when was the first scientist? Descartes, Bacon, Newton? Maybe you could chase it back to the Greeks, but no farther than that. And so the idea that whatever the people who conjured up the Old Testament creation account were doing was something akin to scientific theorizing is a mistake that would only be made by people who don't know how to distinguish between different kinds of truth. And so the fundamentalists, like, I feel for the fundamentalists, because what they're trying to do, to give them credit, is to maintain a corpus of stories in which an ethos is based. That would be the Western ethos, in this case of Christianity, because they believe that the ethos is of extreme value. And I also believe that the ethos is of extreme value and that it is nested in those stories.
Now notice what he's done. He said, I have a lot of respect for the celebrity atheists because they think, and I appreciate what the fundamentalists are doing because they are saying this is threatening an ethos, and this ethos is of value. And Peterson saying, I share that value with them, so I'm sharing things on both sides.
And so they don't like to be confronted by the rationalist, atheist, evolutionary types because it blows the foundation of their ethos apart, and they feel that it's worth preserving. And I think, well, yeah, it is worth preserving. Now,
if I bring in Nick Waltersdorf and Al Plantinga, you would say that those fundamentalists are foundationalists, and they are magic. So I've got the Bible here as the foundation, and my ethos is planted on top of it. And now what isn't seen is that somewhere along the way, some ideas snuck into those fundamentalists that said, this is the way justifiable belief is supposed to be constructed. And so I have to read the Bible in a certain way. I have to read the Bible as history, but again, as a certain kind of history. And I go through that in my framing of the Ben Shapiro video, where I kind of walk through history, because after the Reformation, there was the skepticism about texts. And so the skepticism about text meant that we were going to look for certainty in verification in the physical world, and that is how we are going to get validation for our ideas. Now, and this is Newton's world, and this is why Peterson keeps calling Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and probably Dillahunty also Newtonian, because they're looking for validation in this world. And now Peterson is basically going to say history has moved on because this world is far stranger than the world you pretend to be talking about. And in fact, you don't even act in accordance with the world you're saying how it is.
That doesn't mean that there aren't philosophical problems associated with the manner in which they construct their arguments. But
what I'd like
they're
is
still worthy. But it doesn't address the issue. There's a deep issue here that we're not contending with. Here's an example.
Okay, there's a deep issue we're not contending with. Well, what is he meaning? There's a deep issue here that we're not contending with. There's something on the screen that I'm farting around with. What does Peterson mean? Well, again, Peterson sees Dillahunty and his tribe as not having dealt with everything that Peterson has learned. In a sense, they look on Dillahunty like Dillahunty looks on fundamentalist Christians. Peterson says, you're not dealing with stuff. Well, what aren't we dealing with stuff? Well, let's see if he can talk him into it.
Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't think so. I just finished Well, I thought about it a lot, you know, and I do try to think about where I'm wrong, because I would like to figure out where I'm wrong, because then I wouldn't have to be wrong anymore, right? And being wrong is actually not a good thing. You fall into a pit if you're wrong.
And this is what I point out in the lecture on skepticism, since you didn't get to see the show, is that being wrong feels exactly like being right. Nobody runs around going, oh, I'm wrong, but I'm going to keep believing this. We all assume that we are correct about a great many things. And it's not so much that being wrong is the thing we're afraid of. It's, I think, that being exposed as wrong.
This little speech is very interesting because being wrong feels like being right. And this is why, as I said in the framing video, this is why I think materialism is waning. Because right when you begin to acknowledge the lack of direct contact with truth, you're beginning to recognize all of the problems that led to the development of phenomenology. And again, I mentioned it in the framing video, where how do I know I'm sitting here talking with you and holding this book? What if I were in the Matrix? What if I were plugged in and being a battery? Now you say, well, I'm not, well, you're not in the Matrix. Well, how do you know I'm not in the Matrix? In fact, most of you watching this video have never met me. How do you know that my name isn't really Ralph and I live in Indiana and everything I've told you about me is a lie and you've simply believed it? How do you know that the moon landing wasn't a fabrication? How do you know? How do you know? How do you know? Being right and being wrong feel the same. And then he takes another step, and what we really don't like is being exposed as wrong. Oh my goodness, you are inching up to Peterson land here, Matt. Because, yeah, now you're inching up into phenomenology and psychology, and maybe this feeling is governing it. Now, within a rationalist, modernist thing, you might say, oh, but all of these biases undermine my ability to know the truth. Well, now we're back in C.S. Lewis's Miracles, because how do you know that all these other rationalisms aren't just post hoc rationalizations, just like this feeling that you've just expressed, which is common? This is a really hard thing to know the truth.
Well, we're also sometimes afraid of being wrong, because if you're wrong at a deep level, it can really hurt you.
Oh, I agree.
It can really take you apart. And so people don't like to be taken apart. Like if you're wrong about your wife, for example, that tends to be a very painful thing. And
now, Dillahunty's about to say a joke here, but so think about it this way. And I made this point in my last video. I don't want to just redux the last video, but okay, you come home and your wife's in bed with another man and you're married 30 years. And so you say, hey, what's going on here? And they both sit up in bed and say, ha, joke's on you. We've been having an affair for 20 years and we've pulled your rug over your eyes. I hate you. I've always hated you. And I was just in it for the money and screw you. Well, what was the marriage? The marriage was a lie. Was the marriage real? Well, the marriage used to be real enough to lead to all kinds of actions, anniversary gifts, coming home on time, getting kisses goodnight, having sex, raising children. Now suddenly the marriage isn't real enough to even live together. And you not only say, what was my marriage? You say, who was I? Why couldn't I know the truth? And so again, suddenly we're into this realm of realizing that facts and truth and things is not all that easy. And it's not a matter of us seeing objects. It's a matter of this other frame out there of all these other things. And story governs objects. Whoops.
That should make you popular.
Well, he says, yeah, that's why I take away the frying pan. And Peterson says, that should make you popular. And then Peterson's talking like a psychologist.
Okay, so one of the issues that I have, and you can respond to this, is that the let's say the celebrity atheist types, because I actually like that phrase.
Yeah, you said it twice.
They don't seem to me to be contending with the real issues. They seem
what
to
are
be
the
going
real
at
issues?
Dostoevsky, he's a real issue. Tolstoy, he's a real issue. Carl Jung, 20 books and maybe 15 seminars. He's a real issue. Mircea Eliade, Like, there are some serious heavy hitters in the religious phenomenology domain. And my sense so far, I just finished reading all of Harris's books, for example, is he doesn't contend with them at all.
Now, again, you have to ask, well, what do you mean he doesn't contend with them at all? Well, he doesn't contend. Well, go back to the framing video. Why am I making this video? I've just made a video and I've just explained the whole thing. He doesn't contend with them at all because they make the point that how we act has been shaped by how we've been acting for far longer than 500 years. That Christianity is embedded in our behaviors to such a degree that simply flipping a switch and saying, I don't believe in God, doesn't make that much difference in your ethics and how you live. And again, as I made in the last video, preachers make this point all the time. Preachers will tell people, you don't believe in God enough because he's not changing your behavior. And this is what these people that he's mentioning. Also, Jung. So I knew nothing about Jung when I started this project. So I read Jung's autobiography, and one of the things in that autobiography that struck me is Jung is a young doctor working in a psychiatric hospital, and the older doctors say, don't bother talking to the patients, they're all crazy. And Jung's kind of like, yeah, that's why we're here. We're supposed to heal them, right? And it's like, no, we can't heal them. Just don't bother talking to them. It's just gibberish. So he talks to the patients and begins to realize that these patients are in touch with a far larger story. And that in talking with them about that far larger story, they could actually get better. Now, what does that mean? Charles Taylor talks about a buffered self. And this is kind of how we imagine we're buffered from God, that the supernatural can't get down into us. Now, Peterson is saying, yeah, but we're not buffered from these stories. We, in fact, have been immersed in these stories, and these stories have been shaping our ethics all the way through. I haven't seen Infinity Wars yet, so I saw Ragnarok, and I was watching Ragnarok, and when you watch that movie, even a movie that's got some comedy, it's a superhero movie, it's not supposed to be a deep philosophical movie, but so much of Western society is embedded in that story. And the moment that we're in right now is embedded in the story. I haven't seen Solo yet. Is that out yet? I don't know. It's coming out at some point. But the last Star Wars movie that a lot of people didn't like. Why? Because all of the stuff we're dealing with is embedded in that story. And so much is embedded in our behavior. And we've been watching these two basically be playing these games, acting stuff out. Christianity is deeply embedded in this, and that's why he looks at Sam Harris and now Dillahunty and says, you haven't taken any of these guys seriously. Because if you're actually going to try and root out, now pay attention to that word, and if you ever acted it out, I have these Texas privets in my backyard, and when I want to get rid of them, I have to root them out. And it's a lot of heavy, hard work because those roots run. And so you've got to root them out. You're going to have to root Christianity out, which is what Nietzsche's project was. And and Peterson is looking at the celebrity atheists and saying, I don't see that you guys are doing that at all. Well, on what basis aren't you seeing that? Because your life hasn't changed at all. In fact, you can't even imagine what a clean-roomed atheist ethic would look like. In other words, you fit in very well with the rest of the Americans. A lot of them who are moralistic therapeutic deists, some of them are Christians, some of them are Muslims. In fact, when someone comes from another country and they have a very different culture, we see some of this with Islam, there's a very different reaction. Now, it's really interesting that, for example, Sam Harris has all these confrontations with Islam. Well, why? Well, they're from a different place. He's not having those confrontations with all the Christians. Why? Because their ethics the roots are all intertwined, and they're not taking any of this seriously enough.
And it's like, for me, that's like being an evolutionary biologist and not being aware of Darwin. It's actually a big problem. It's not something you can hand wave away. Jung was a mystic. It's like, sorry. He was about as smart as Friedrich Nietzsche.
I think this gets to basically the same point I was talking about before. The thing that you're objecting to, it seems, is that many of us don't want to address the aspects of religion that you find value in, because we're only focused on perhaps as I'm talking in the show, from a scientific skepticism perspective of, are there valid and sound arguments that would lead one to conclude that a God exists?
See, this is where Dillahunty not knowing Peterson matters, because Peterson is basically saying, you don't act like there isn't a God. And in fact, none of us have any idea how to act as if there isn't a God, because God is so simply baked into all of our systems. And Dillahunty wants to pull back and go back into the movie theater. Now, I've used this metaphor before. Dillahunty, in a sense, says we see objects in space, and we as actors interact with objects in space. That's reality. Peterson's view of reality is very different. Peterson says what being is a forum for action. And what we're going to see throughout this video is that this line doesn't get crossed. I think Peterson is a little bit more aware of Dillahunty's frame than Dillahunty is aware of Peterson's frame. But their disagreement with frames is going to mean they often talk past each other, and this was a great example of talking past each other. I don't think Dillahunty had any idea the point that Peterson just made.
My answer to this so far seems to be no. And the apologists, the theologians, they keep presenting the arguments, the teleological arguments, moral arguments, and all these things. They have nothing to do with the phenomenology of religion. They have nothing to do with how this impacts people's lives. This is a question of, is it in fact the case? Is it consistent?
Well, let me take that back. On basis of what he just said, I think he has some idea of what it is, but I still don't think he's engaging in Peterson's question.
Consistent with reality that there is a God, and is it consistent with reality that there is good reason to believe there's a God? That is where the focus is primarily.
Yeah.
See, primarily, he's in the movie theater. He wants to sit back and look at things and decide whether or not he is, wants to sit back and look at things, whether or not stuff is on the screen. And Peterson's like, we're not on a screen. We're in the water.
And it's usually construed as a scientific issue.
Well, it's not so. I would never construe it as a scientific issue because science can't confirm the supernatural. I mean, we are blocked until somebody demonstrates a mechanism by which we can explore and confirm the existence of the supernatural, and then confirm that it actually can impact the natural world. We're stuck, which is why science relies on methodological naturalism.
You seem to be able to do it with psychedelics.
Okay, so right here, Dillahunty kind of, is this debate about whether or not there's a God, or is this a debate as to whether or not a concept like God should impact public life? Peterson says he's already there, you're not going to get rid of him. Dillahunty says, no, we can take God out by no longer mentioning his name. Peterson says you're naive. God is baked into the system God is baked into your culture to such a degree that you can't even root him out. Now, obviously, if you want a clean room experiment, say, okay, well, let's go back to the pre-Christian world and see what they believed. And I would advise you to do that. Go back to the pre-Christian world and read primary source materials of the ancient world. And so, okay, no Christianity there. Read the Greeks. Not much Judaism there. What's going on? Well, is God out of the picture? Maybe a few Greeks, but even then, their atheism is not like our atheism. And so I think Peterson would argue that God has already, in fact, impacted your atheism in ways that you're not owning up to.
Psychedelic drugs.
And I really wish, so why is Peterson taking us down the route of psychedelic drugs? Because, well, we want to talk evidence. And so now Peterson is going to say, change in life. Okay, that's the basis here of ontology. Change in life is going to be evidence for reality. So the woman who killed herself because of her husband's mistress, when no mistress can be found, the mistress in the woman's head was real enough to prompt the suicide. Change in life is enough.
You seem to be able to do what with psychedelic drugs?
Well, everybody that takes them under reliable settings generally comes back and claims the presence of a mystical experience.
Yeah,
and that
but
seems to be duplicatable and replicable across cultures in labs with multiple different substances, the chemical constituents of which are known very well. It's like it's part of this religious phenomenology. And to me, that's just a set of facts. And we know that people have been using those substances to evoke mystical and religious experiences for, who knows, 150,000 years maybe.
Sure.
We can at least infer that. And we have no idea whatsoever how much of an effect the use of those substances has had on the metaphysical substrate of our culture.
Right there, okay? So he's talking about the drugs, and now Dillahunty's going to come back and say, yeah, but we don't know that this, in fact, says anything about the supernatural. Now, again, I want to do a video on natural and supernatural in terms of the question, could you, if something supernatural happened, could you see it in any other frame but the natural? In other words, if a miracle happened, would you know it? Well, you might say, well, that's different from everything else I've seen. Okay, different, but then the job is trying to explain it with respect to the other with respect to other things, or do we just say, well, that was a one-off thing? In other words, everything we see happening to us comes through terms we can understand, or at least terms we can apprehend with either our senses or our mind's eye. Now at this point, Peterson says, well, this stuff is duplicatable, but, oh shoot, no. Let me go back.
So use of those substances has had on the metaphysical substrate of our culture.
Right there. Use of those substances has had on the metaphysical substrate of our culture. In other words, people have been using psychedelics way back, before the Christian era. So use of psychedelics has impacted the Greeks. I don't know if it has or not. Has impacted Africans, has impacted certainly Native Americans. So in other words, this has been baked into our culture, and it's been real enough that we have acted out of it.
So what constitutes scientific data here is by no means clear. Here's an example of this.
So in other words, he's kind of asking the question, okay, the supernatural, how do we get at it? Now, Jordan Peterson's a psychologist. Well, how does a psychologist work? How does someone who is working in psychometrics work? Well, you ask people questions, and you ask enough people questions, and you try to ask questions in such a way because you can't get into what their head is, so you look at how they answer questions, you look at what they do, you look at what they say, and you try to construct all that data, and then you call that science. He's a social scientist. Now, this is, again, distinguished from hard science, and I'm not going to get into that entire debate, but one might ask Dillahunty if he, in fact, takes anything in from soft sciences, because this is how Jordan Peterson does science. And he says, hey, we can look at these pharmacological, these psychedelics, and we can see they have impact, and they have extraordinary impact. Therefore, now I'm jumping ahead, might we not believe that this is evidence for something that is beyond us?
Example. So,
well, before the example,
yeah.
As someone who's been high as a kite, I fully agree that people take drugs and report experiences that they describe as mystical or supernatural. Just like people report other experiences as if they were religious or ghosts or whatever. We have no way of confirming that this something mystical or supernatural actually happened. What this is about the length.
Okay, that's his frame. So we're back to the modernist frame, and he's continuing to work his ontological project.
Stops people from smoking.
Well, you can stop smoking without any sort of supernatural intervention.
No, not really.
You can't stop smoking without supernatural?
There aren't really any reliable chemical means for inducing smoking cessation. You can use a drug called bupropion. I think that's the one. It's whatever Wellbutrin is.
Is that supernatural?
No, you don't need a supernatural effect, but it doesn't work very well. But if you give people magic mushrooms, psilocybin, and they have a mystical experience, they have about an 85% chance of smoking cessation with one treatment. Yeah, but that's kind of like evidence, you know. It's kind of like evidence.
It's evidence that you can take mushrooms and increase your chance of quitting smoking. But
No, it's not. It's indication that if you take mushrooms and you have a mystical experience, you'll stop smoking, because it doesn't work if you don't have
So now Peterson's trying to bring experience in here, because notice it's not just this drug means you quit smoking, it's this drug plus the experience. And so in a sense what Peterson is doing, he's keeping his secular lid open. It could be that something is acting and we're initiating it with this. Now, I would get into...
You take mushrooms and you have an experience that you describe as mystical, then you'll increase your chance of smoking. But that doesn't tell me whether or not there was something to this notion that they had an experience that was supernatural in any sense.
Well, it's not definitive evidence.
It's not evidence at all.
Oh, sure it is. Oh, sure it is.
No,
how is it? Wait a second. That's wrong.
Okay.
That's classic Peterson.
It is evidence.
Now also pay attention. There's some status going on here, and you might ask yourself, who has higher status, Jordan Peterson or Matt Dillahunty? Probably Jordan Peterson. He's got a best-selling book out. He's got more YouTube subscribers. He's running a bigger show than Dillahunty. Now, if you looked at Jordan Peterson on Bill Maher, Maher has higher status. Now status is always contextual, but status plays into this conversation here too.
So because look.
But Dillahunty has the crowd, so these things are vying.
Look,
no, he's right.
You want to speak.
Right.
You want to think through this skeptically. Okay, you have a pharmacological substance. It's psilocybin. You give it to people who are trying to quit smoking. The psilocybin doesn't directly have an impact on the smoking behavior. It has to elicit what's described subjectively as a mystical experience. And you can get physiological indicators of that mystical experience. And you might say, well, that's not enough to prove that it's a mystical experience. But,
Now, again, what do you mean by mystical experience?
You're conscious, and I accept that. It's like you accept all sorts of things without being able to demonstrate their validity on every possible objective with every possible objective criteria.
And again, this is his main argument, that he is more skeptical than Dillahunty. In fact, he is skeptical about Dillahunty's frame. He is skeptical about all of the assumptions that have snuck into his ontology and his ontological project with respect to the existence of a being called God. And he doesn't think Dillahunty is actually able to demonstrate all this.
So don't get in too much of a hurry. It's a serious issue.
A little talking down there, and which also reflects status.
If you give people psilocybin, for example, and they have a mystical experience, not only are they much more likely to quit smoking, which is really something, but they're also much less likely to suffer from death anxiety if they have cancer. Like, that's quite the thing. And not only that,
It's quite the thing, especially if you're a clinical therapist, a clinical psychologist who's trying to help people with their anxiety.
if you test them a year later and they've had a mystical experience, which the majority of them regard as the most significant one, two, or three experiences of their life.
He's a psychologist, and he's a social scientist. This is all data for him. These are facts for him. Now, I don't know that these are facts for Dillahunty.
Including such things as getting married, their personalities are permanently altered in the direction of more openness to experience and more creativity by a standard deviation. Like, that's walloping effects.
Someone should just do something with how he says, one of my favorite things, walloping. It's just a fun thing.
So we can't get too much in a hurry about dispensing with all that.
Skepticism, as I repeatedly point out in the show, is not about cynicism. It's not about debunking. And I'm not saying that there is no supernatural and that there is no mystical experience. What I'm saying is the thing that people subjectively describe as, I had an incredibly impactful mystical experience, whether it comes from taking a pharmaceutical, whether it comes from attending a revival church service or hearing a particular preacher, whether it comes from having a particularly impressive sexual experience, all of those things, that is the subjective description of that, which may be because of limitations in language, that they don't have any other. This is the language that infuses culture, so that we have to use that to describe it.
Okay. That's a very important little speech too, because he, in a sense, is saying, I think rightfully so, I know enough to know I have to be agnostic about some ontology. But we pick up this language from each other, and this is merely the language that we use, and the use of this language itself should not be used to imply an ontology of a God, an ontology of a supernatural. In other words, we shouldn't take this language literally, but there's an implicit, deeper statement on there that it is not justifiable to take this language literally. And again, he's dealing, again, watch my framing video, he's dealing with foundationalism here. He's got a set of rules about justified beliefs that, well, there's a set of rules about justified beliefs. He's not taking any time constructing these rules. In fact, are running these rules all the way down to their sources. And he might not even be able to. And this is, again, what Peterson is saying, is that Peterson is going to say, our deepest level is the level that we act on. And so that's the level that we're really believing in.
But that doesn't in any way serve to confirm that there is any sort of supernatural realm or any sort of supernatural actor.
Well, it depends on how you define supernatural. Like, look, I get your point.
Okay.
And I'm not claiming that the phenomena of...
Now, but notice, Peterson, depends on how we define supernatural. Again, go back to the framing video. Peterson's definition of supernatural is going to be different than Dillahunty's. And so here we have, again, they're not talking directly. They're not...
of psilocybin intoxication is direct proof for the existence of God. I'm not saying that. I am saying...
Although that'd be awesome.
Yeah. Well, people do report personal experiences of that sort of thing. So it's not completely out of the realm of the experience. But it's also because of the problem of the border between the subjective and the objective. It's difficult to probe deeply enough to come up with anything definitive.
The border between the subjective and the objective. So right here, too, we are seeing, well, what are we talking about here? Well, Dillahunty is talking about ontology. And Peterson is saying, well, there's the subjective. And he's more skeptical than Dillahunty in terms of we can't, to what degree can we know? We are so susceptible of being fooled. I might be fooled about which book I'm holding. Someone might have come into my office and, I've been telling you this is amusing ourselves to death, but someone might have come into my office and replaced the book inside of it with a book of equal size. And so I may be fooled about what book I'm holding. And in fact, this ability to be fooled goes much further down than we want to admit.
And I understand that that's a problem. But the supernatural issue, that's a different issue. Like, people are capable of entering different experiential realms where things are qualitatively different to them. The perceptions are different, the thoughts are different, their response to the world is different. They feel that they've died an ego death and transcended their normal mode of perception. Like, maybe that's not part of the supernatural, but then you're starting to define the supernatural pretty narrowly. Like,
no,
do you require miracle, like here and now? Something that defies the laws of physics? Or
Okay, and when I do my video on natural and supernatural, we're going to have to get into this law of physics thing a little bit more deeply. I mentioned it in some other videos, so some strong pushback by some people, but there's quite a bit to that.
what's your definition of the supernatural?
So there is the natural world,
Yeah.
and then there are people who make claims that something is not part of the natural world, that it has some external supernatural origin.
Now, again, in the frame video, I began C.S. Lewis's Miracles. Okay, the naturalist says there's only the natural world. It's the whole show. Supernaturalist says there's the natural world and then there's something external. So, in a sense, Dillahunty and C.S. Lewis, they're talking on the same page.
Those are the claims that I don't see how we can make any sort of epistemologically sound confirmation of. I'm fine with accepting that people have these experiences. I've been, I was, for many, many years, fundamentalist Southern Baptist, and I remember standing in church and feeling what I would have described at the time as the Holy Ghost, sweeping through me. Now, many years later, I look back at that and I say, why did I describe this particular experience this way? It's a unique experience. It's of the same quality as something you might experience from a drug, or I've experienced similar things from music and drugs and sex, but they're not all exactly the same. And this is kind of the caveat that the believers, for any one of them, would use is, the thing you're talking about, when you had awesome sex or you were on drugs, that's not the same as what I felt the Holy Spirit. I felt all of them.
Now, okay, so you have experience, and then you have interpretation of experience. And what he's saying is, I am disallowing these interpretations of experience. Okay, so what? We all have multiple interpretations of experience. Now, what I think is implicit in this is, I am disallowing these interpretations of experience in the public square. Well, what do you mean by that? Because in the public square, we use these rules of evidence. We use this foundationalism. You have to justify with reason these positions, and therefore I think you can't do that with these interpretations of experience.
The reason I would have said at the time that I had been filled with the Holy Spirit is because everybody around me was saying that too. It's not like I have any sort of any way to demonstrate a causal connection between a Holy Spirit and my experience. It was, I had an experience, and I, like everyone else around me, attributed it to the Holy Spirit.
What was the experience like?
Elation, euphoria. I don't think I ever...
Peterson hasn't been to church enough. You see, you don't need psilocybin. You can get this stuff without the drug.
Had visions, but certainly it was an overwhelming sensation. You get the goosebumps or hair on your head. And I remember fairly distinctly the first time I had a very similar experience outside of church, because it was from listening to secular music that my church would not have allowed. And then I began to look into things, from far more of a psychological perspective of what type of impact specific music has on people. And
so in other words, and I think this is the path he's talking about is this, okay, this is the subtraction story. This is where I'm beginning to realize that my experiences are constructed, and if they're constructed, then they are natural and not supernatural. So supernatural are non-constructed things, and natural experiences are constructed. Therefore, if I can induce this kind of elation experience that I once identified as the Holy Spirit, if I can induce it, let's say, with a drug, or if I can induce it with, say, secular music instead of Christian music, now the frame that I had been interpreting the experience within is now broken, and therefore the experience is natural, and all experiences are part of the whole show. That's essentially the deconversion move.
A friend of mine, we've had conversations about the cadence of particular preachers, because a Southern Baptist minister will have a different cadence than a Pentecostal preacher, and they'll have a different cadence than somebody else, and I won't put on a performance to do them, but we have this intense curiosity as to, are the successful preachers with those cadence in conjunction with the music, are they just tapping into some sort of psychological impact in our brain in order to make us pliable, in the same way that the elevator experiment, where you have everybody face the back of the elevator, and somebody walks in and they face the doors, and after a while a lot of them become uncomfortable and turn around and face the back with everybody else for no reason. It's just compliance.
And this again, I'm really going to have to do a video on this. Natural and supernatural. If you were made by a God to feel a certain way in a certain context, and he's the God of creation, which means he built it in from the ground up, would your experience be, could you tell the difference between a true experience of the Holy Spirit and a false one? Well, actually, Christianity talks about that. Angels of light being deceived, blah, 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 blah. I, on the basis of holding this book, and I've picked this book up a number of times, I have not once decided to open this book and see if amusing yourselves to death is still inside. I have simply been assuming that, when I'm not here, my office is locked, nobody's broken in, nothing has happened, that this book is how I left it. Okay, it's my experience.
Well, you don't want those backward facers to attack you,
It would be good. But if we're back to back, I think, anyway.
Okay, so let me ask
Sure.
you a question about that. Okay, because I think this gets to the heart of some of these issues. So let's say that we can agree that throughout history and before, people were experiencing a set of transcendent emotions that can be evoked by music and dance and other forms of ritual and in a variety of other ways. But there's also a profound proclivity on the part of people, for one reason or another, to attribute those to some sort of supernatural agency.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a common sense argument. Now, I'm sitting here holding this book, and you might say, oh, Vanderclay, come on. Common sense says this book is what you say it is. Peterson kind of flips that over and says, okay, people have been having these spiritual experiences for a long time. Common sense, they have attributed it to a certain thing. The innocent attribution itself has some validity in the argument. In other words, you come home and you find, let's say you're a man, you come home, you go into your bedroom, you find a pair of men's underwear on the floor of your bedroom that is a brand you don't own. What does common sense say? Well, this is where we get into all of the difficulty that contemporary psychology has understood about our impressions. I can make up all kinds of stories because I have a real need in my mind to not believe my wife is cheating. My wife can make up a story and I believe her because she's been honest with me. And this then gets into the skeptical challenges to a lot of seeing objects that modernity presupposes.
Now, okay, so I want to separate that from another line of thinking. Okay, so let's just leave that aside. So we could think of that as a theory about the origin of religious belief. The experience comes first. It comes along with an implicit hypothesis about supernatural actors behind the scenes eliciting these experiences. Okay, that's in marked distinction to other theories of religious derivation, like Freud's theory, for example, that religion is a defense against death anxiety, or Marx's theory that religion is the opiate of the masses. Right? It's a much more biological theory, the one we're putting forward.
Sure.
Okay, and it seems to me to be a much more credible theory, even though religious movements can be harnessed for economic purposes and for purposes of manipulation and all of that, obviously.
Yeah,
So,
I would think that there's any number of explanations I've heard for the origins of religion, and I find almost all of them plausible in different forms.
And he just told us his bias. Okay, so you've got a bias. So, what does bias do to reason? Don't we normally discredit reason on the basis of bias? And you just told us you're biased, that you're biased for one. Well, on one hand, that's good that you own it. On the other hand, okay, you're biased.
Except for the one that asserts that they come directly from a supernatural being.
well, okay, so that's the one we're gonna pursue, though, because
That was funnier than I thought it was. I was just being honest.
yeah, well, honesty is often funnier than people think it is.
Boy, don't I know.
So people can have these experiences and they can be evoked in a variety of ways, and people often find them very valuable, at least in terms of their subjective report.
I agree.
And the psilocybin experiments and also the large-scale analysis of psychedelic drug users, by the way, also indicate that the use of such substances is generally associated with an increment in health rather than a decrement, which is quite interesting, right? It's not something you'd necessarily expect.
Now, again, this is interesting data that, psychedelics are good for you. You want to be careful with that, but that's what he's saying. And now beneath that is an argument that, we use all the time in terms of, well, if I eat right, I'll be more healthy. And so it's kind of an argument from design that if we do things in accordance with how we've been designed, and that might include having religious experiences, and there's been a lot of data in terms of people who are religious, they live longer, they're happier, they give more to charity, so on and so forth. A lot of that stuff you can just measure because it's simply out there. But again, as Dillahunty would know, but that doesn't mean there's a God. No. But again, Peterson is a social scientist and he looks at data.
So here's a question. Why in the world do the people who have these experiences have the proclivity to attribute them to supernatural sources, like to a divine source? Like what's going on there? Why?
And again, here you have the argument from the innocent observer. Someone walks into a store, sees someone with a gun, immediately assumes it's a robbery. Well, probably is. And in other words, now there might be a whole nother string of things that mean that the person with the gun is an undercover police officer and they're arresting the guy for selling alcohol to underage kids. I mean, we can get fooled in all kinds of different ways, but in a sense, the innocent, obvious expression has validity in the culture.
Is that the case?
So best guess, and this is contrary. So the skepticism isn't about, hey, let's debunk this and come up with. But if we were going to go through potential plausible explanations, to me, this is very similar to in the 40s and 50s when people were supposedly abducted by aliens or ran into aliens. They had descriptions of aliens that pretty much were varied and often matched the various monsters that you saw in the movies then. After 2001, or after Close Encounters of the Third Kind, almost all descriptions of aliens became the almond-headed, this. Mm-hmm. The narrative in the culture about what an alien was converged. Yeah. And people were, this is what I experienced. In the same way that people will, sometimes cameras will catch orbs, or a particular lighting effect in a house that is supposedly haunted will be perceived as a ghost, as a spiritual, humanoid form. When we, in some cases, can show that that's actually not the case. In other cases, we have no idea what they necessarily saw. But because what people understand about spirits and souls and ghosts is in the zeitgeist of how we think, it enters the consciousness as a plausible explanation, even if ultimately there's no such thing as ghosts.
And again, when he made this argument, I thought, is he going to be a Jungian? Is there a collective unconscious that we're working from? Because it's a really interesting argument, because, again, something that depth psychologists should be all over, because, okay, so someone came up with something and everyone is mirroring it. Well, where's Rupert Sheldrake and his mimetic theory? This is a very interesting argument he's putting forward. But again, he's saying, well, there's nothing supernatural. But in a sense, he put forward an argument that we're connected in ways that we are not consciously aware of. Okay. So what else might we not be consciously aware of? Or what else might we, in fact, be acting out that we are unconsciously aware of that is true? Let's say all the people who are making those funny shaped aliens after Close Encounters don't recognize that they're spoofing the movie or they're mimicking the movie, but they're doing it. In other words, you act out more than you consciously know. Well, what does that say about us? And what does that say about your project, which usually is about reason and rationality and having all of those facts and running through your syllogisms?
That explains why they converge, but it doesn't explain why the initial impetus is the attribution of the experiences to something supernatural.
Well, and it doesn't explain why the Close Encounters people started the new trend. Explain that. Did one of them actually see an alien? We don't know. Did one of them get revelation from alien beings, what they actually look like, to correct? We don't know. Just the fact that it got carried on does not give an explanation about how it started in the first place.
Like to something. See, I'm fair enough.
I'm sure that I'm not convinced that necessarily that the natural instinct is to apply it to something supernatural. I think it may be more the case that not only are we pattern recognition machines, but we're the descendants of people who, how you see faces and everything.
Yeah, that's a good hypothesis. That's the,
And so you see faces, or you anticipate that there's something in the bush out to get you, and when you go and actually investigate and you find there's nothing in the bush out to get you, rather than assuming that you might have been mistaken, maybe it's a spirit.
Yeah, the social psychologists call that the hyperactive agency detector.
And the fact that we can be, before we had a good understanding, we still don't have a good understanding of death and the mind and stuff. But if I'm standing here talking to you and I drop over dead, there's a clear, undeniable difference in me sitting here as an animated being and me laying there as no longer there. And so it seems a natural inference that something that about me has left. That doesn't mean that there's actually something about me, like a soul or whatever, that's left. We don't tend to think the same thing when the radio stops working or the television stops working. It's not like the man in the TV has left. It's just off. But it seems that those sorts of natural...
I don't know if you want to use that analogy, because it suggests that whatever's in the TV is coming from an external source.
Peterson's a Jungian.
And you're definitely not making that argument with regards to the soul.
Well, the TV station isn't in my living room, so there's at least some external source sending it to there.
Right, but that's exactly my point.
Yeah, that's all I was going for.
You make a case that consciousness isn't exactly in your head either, even though it's localized there.
So why would I think consciousness is anywhere other than my head?
Well, why did so much of human history assume it wasn't in your head? And why did you begin to assume it was? And in fact, this is why Peterson makes the comment about the television and the radio thing. Forget which brain book I read, made exactly this argument. At the end, this book spent most of the time talking about how consciousness and our desires and our likes and dislikes in our life is attributed to all of the things inside of us. And at the end, basically making the point that, but we don't really know that. Let's use, in fact, his own example of the aliens after Close Encounters. Where did those images come from? They didn't come from inside your head. We don't know how those images came into people. Well, they picked them up. They must have seen them. Well, do we know that? Well, again, look at Rupert Sheldrake's and Matt's running an identical maze in different parts of the world. Run it faster after it's been run, someplace. Dogs knowing that. There's just a lot of weird stuff in this world that we can't explain. Now, I don't want to go off into the fringe and say, here everything's weird, so we can't believe anything, but...
How do you account for consciousness?
Well, I'm not sure that we can account for consciousness.
This is definitely true.
But
yes. See, and that's
I have
another
no reason to think that it's
another...
beyond, what the brain produces. The fact that something's mysterious doesn't mean that, if something's mysterious...
Consciousness isn't just mysterious. It's like really mysterious. It's the most mysterious thing.
Okay, well,
right? It's not like ordinary mysterious.
The fact that something is really mysterious to the point where I think you and I would agree that we don't have an explanation for it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if there was something like that.
And if we don't have an explanation for it, we default to what? Our presuppositions.
We'll say that it's maybe consciousness. We agree we don't have an explanation, or at least a complete one for consciousness?
Or even a partial one.
Okay, sure.
So, it seems vaguely associated
consciousness
with the brain.
Is really mysterious, and you and I have no explanation for it. As human beings, we're uncomfortable with saying, I don't know. This is something I'm trying to teach people to become more comfortable with, is to say, I don't know. And so when you ask me about consciousness, my answer is, I don't know. But for other people, they're so uncomfortable with I don't know that they posit an explanation that they cannot justify, something that's untestable and unfalsifiable, and that is that there's a ghost in the machine.
So untestable and unfalsifiable is your standard. And okay, so you want to teach people to say, I don't know. Okay, but there's also things, your I don't know also has some of its own biases. And if, again, we're reading C.S. Lewis's Miracles, we discredit answers because they are, this is C.S. Lewis's big point in Miracles, at least in the early part of the book. We discredit reasons because they are constructed. And so you get to an I point, no, I don't know, and people decide when they make up an answer. Well, how do we know when we're making up an answer versus how do we know we're using reason? And now that's going to be C.S. Lewis's argument that reason is a kind of supernatural thing that we do because what we're actually doing is transcending nature. Because the natural thing would be to quickly grab any post hoc argument that addresses whatever it is we're trying to address. Reason says, this is what Dillahunty wants to do and what other rationalists want to do. Reason says we're going to take a separation from ourselves and go into try and go into this monarchical vision and construct for ourselves this line of argument by which we can have certainty, and through the certainty by which we can have community.
I can't make that leap because it is entirely speculation without.
Is this pride? Is pride the reason you can't make this leap? I don't know. Do you know why you can't make this leap? Is the reason you can't make this leap because you have status? Is the reason you can't make this leap because you saw Christians acting like idiots and one day decided you didn't want to be like an idiot? Were the Christians mean? What's the reason you can't make this leap? I mean, that's the entire project. And the depth psychologist will begin to say, well, how much do you know whether or not you can make this leap?
Without support. It seems intuitively right because of how we view the world. And yet, I would rather say, I don't know, and then continue to explore it, because I worry that by asserting what the explanation is, you stop looking for the actual explanation.
Okay, so you made the case that part of the reason that we assume being.
Now that continuing to explore is an interesting thing too, because let's imagine you were trying to solve a math problem, and well, what happens if it's a very difficult math problem? You work and you get an answer and you think, do I think that's right? I do it again, I get a different answer. Do I think that's right? At what point do you stop exploring? How do you know if you got the math problem right? Well, in terms of reason, you say, well, if I follow all the steps, I will get the math problem right. Okay, have you followed all the steps? Usually you use more than one person to have other people check your work.
Beings is because there's a being that seems lacking in death. And that was associated. I had asked the question about why people attribute their mystical experiences to supernatural beings. So we kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but it was related. So we could say, well, your idea is something like people personify the soul for obvious reasons, and they also have a hyperactive agency detector. And so it's the combination of whatever mechanisms that produce that
Sure.
allow them to attribute supernatural personification to the source of mystical experiences. It's
Sure.
something like that. Yeah, okay. So let me ask you something. We'll get back to that, maybe.
No, you won't. Not enough
that's
time.
fine.
Let me ask you something about consciousness. You tell me what you think about this, okay?
Okay.
All right, so this is how it looks to me. I mean, there's lots of ways of thinking about how people interact with the world. But I think this is how we treat ourselves and other people as we see them acting in the world.
Okay, now Peterson's, well, this might be a good time to stop because we've gone on a little while. Now Peterson is turning and saying, okay, we've been kind of playing in your realm here and I've been poking at it. Now I want to present my take on this, and then we can see if we can poke holes in that. So it's a good place to stop right now, because it's about an hour and I've got a couple other videos that I want to post. And so thanks for watching. I'll have to do another video sometime.